I was a student here, and so I started here 25 years ago this fall. I earned my Master of Architecture degree, and my housemate at that time was a guy named Gunnar Hubbard, who actually runs a green building consultancy now, a very successful one. And he was the head of a student organization, the precursor to the EDC, called the Solar Energy Information Center. And they had a little office over in Pacific Hall, and they were doing really wonderful things, sort of retrofitting buildings and things, engaged in some design building. And so we graduated, and we knew a guy who was in the program and also earning a planning degree. And you may have heard him last year, a guy named Kevin Parkhurst. And Kevin decided to take on as his thesis project the idea of organizing a conference around sustainability and ecological design. And the motivation at that time was the fact that in architecture, primarily, it was a lot of architects, but landscape architects as well at that time. The degree of interdisciplinarity has changed and evolved. Sometimes it's mostly architects, who I love. I always feel it's kind of richer when there's landscape architects, there's planners, art students. They're a little harder to attract because they don't want to be involved in anything that's organized. Yeah. So Kevin thought at that time that sustainability wasn't as embedded in the curricula of the programs at AAA as he thought it should be, and the others that he was working with. And so the original idea of a HOPES conference was to bring leaders here to talk about their work, their professional work, their research, as a way to influence how we would teach and learn at the University of Oregon. And I have to say that this is maybe the best example, although I could provide many examples of how student-initiated activity has had a deep influence on the kind of bones and structure of this school, which I think is absolutely amazing. So I think Design Bridge is another wonderful example of that. So that started it, and so over the years, it's, again, like I said, it's had its varying degrees of interdisciplinarity. A couple things I would say: there used to be an advisory board, so there were people who were around campus, and there were practitioners in the community, and the HOPES organizers would often have this advisory board come in, and they were helpful because they provided some collective memory. Like, they'd been around, they'd attended 10 HOPES conferences in a row, they knew who, well, that's a great speaker, but they were here 3 years ago, maybe you want somebody different. So I'm not suggesting that you reconstitute the board, but if you feel like it's valuable to have some outside influence, that's something that you might want to think about. The other thing the advisory board said is there's always been gender parity with regard to the keynote speakers. And that's just, if it's about ecological design and equity, and, we're truly trying to model practice in the future, we should be thinking about diversity, we should be thinking about gender equity, we should be thinking about interdisciplinarity. I would say that I wrote a book that I gave a talk at HOPES about last April, and I honestly would look for the influences in that book, and this conference has had more influence on the book than anything else. The intellectual influences that students brought to this school, I think, is absolutely phenomenal. And so a few years ago, pre-Will Smith and Carolyn, I would say we were in a kind of a lull in terms of the number of people who showed up. I'd say the last couple of years, it's picked up again. I think there was a kind of maybe a sense that, have we accomplished our mission here? Because sustainability is much more embedded in curricula here, right? So have we accomplished our mission? I would say that even though architectural practice, landscape architectural practice, has changed a lot in a generation, we're dealing with things that we weren't dealing with 20 years ago. Our commitments to sustainability. I mean, if you think about it, construction's a pretty conservative industry, and how far they've come along, largely from pressure from design professionals to fundamentally change the way that we do make things is pretty incredible. But there's so much work to do that I think that you guys provide an opportunity to continue to bring in some fairly radical influences, which could be mainstream design practice 10 years from now. And that's basically what's happened. So I don't feel like mission accomplished. I personally feel like we still have an enormous amount of work to do. My thing now is if energy was the first wave of sustainable design and if climate change is the second, I definitely think water's where it's going to completely change the way we think about the built environment in the next 20 years. That's my own conviction. I'd be curious to know what your convictions are and who you would bring to talk about what the future of the built environment looks like. So I feel like you guys have still an important mission to carry out. I think one of the things, it's so hard to put on an event like this, logistics and arranging the lodging and getting the meet technology in place and everything. The publicity is also a really important thing. And one of the things that I've been encouraging for years is maybe target an audience. So I would say in years past, is it about AAA and we want to bring every AAA student to this thing? Or do we want it to be opened up to a university community? We want to hit the School of Business, we want to hit law, we want to hit blah, 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 whatever, the natural science. Or do we want to hit undergraduate programs which have a design focus? So it used to be 10 years ago that Evergreen College, Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, has a non-professional undergrad kind of sustainable design degree program. And they would send a van down here every year, and they would take part folks, and 3 or 4 of them would end up being students in our master's programs. It's actually a really, really cool thing. It used to be the case when there were people from other universities coming in that we would volunteer to put people up. So professors, there'd be an email that would go out, hey, would you be willing to put some people up? Students would put people up. It's actually a really cool thing. That's an option. But I think it would be really useful to ask, what's the purpose? Is it to continue to bring in these more radical influences or these what seem like marginal, extreme practice, which will be the mainstream in 10 years? And what kind of audience, if you wanted to grow the awareness of hopes, which again is an absolutely incredible thing, who would you want to bring here? And how would you target that audience, appeal to them, and bring them on board? And maybe you can't hit the community and the university and AAA and outside university, but maybe you decide that for the themes of the conference and what we're trying to accomplish, if we really targeted this audience, we could bring in some really wonderful people and have a really rich and inspiring conversation about ecological design.